He thought he was just saving a stranger from danger, but what he discovers about her will turn his entire world upside down. One act of courage leads to a life-changing revelation you won't see coming. Stay till the end to witness a story that proves kindness can rewrite destinies. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know. The streets were quieter than usual as Jake made his way home after another tiring day at work. Life for Jake had become a series of routines. Wake up, commute, work, go home, and repeat. He lived in a modest apartment, held a job he wasn't passionate about, and carried the weight of unspoken frustrations. At 30, Jake had thought life would offer more, but instead, it felt like it was passing him by. The cool evening breeze swept through the empty streets, and Jake shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets. His thoughts drifted, how he felt stuck in life, how disconnected he was from the world around him. Even when he noticed other people's problems, like a homeless man asking for change or someone struggling with groceries, he often kept walking. "Not my problem," he would mutter to himself, convincing himself that people had to fend for themselves. Tonight felt no different. The dim glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement as Jake turned down a side street, trying to cut a few minutes off his walk. That's when he heard it. Muffled voices, followed by the sound of shuffling feet. He slowed down, scanning the alleyway just ahead. His heart raced as the voices turned into sharp, angry tones. Jake froze at the mouth of the alley, his breath catching in his throat. Just a few steps away, he saw two figures. A woman. Sophia, though he wouldn't learn her name until later, was backed against a wall, clutching her purse tightly. The other figure, a man wearing a hood and wielding a knife, growled at her to hand it over. For a moment, Jake's instincts screamed at him to turn back. "Don't get involved," his inner voice warned. "This isn't your fight." But just as quickly, another thought struck him. What if that was your sister? A surge of adrenaline coursed through him, overriding the fear gnawing at his chest. Without thinking, Jake stepped forward. "Hey, leave her alone," he shouted, his voice louder and more confident than he felt. The mugger turned sharply toward Jake, eyes narrowing under the dim light. Sophia's gaze flickered between Jake and her attacker, fear evident in her expression. For a second, Jake thought the man might run, but instead, the mugger lunged at him, knife glinting in the streetlight. Jake barely had time to react. He sidestepped, grabbing the mugger's arm in a clumsy but desperate attempt to wrestle the knife away. The two of them struggled, awkward, messy, and terrifying. Jake's mind raced, heart pounding in his chest, but somehow, he managed to kick the man back. With a grunt, the mugger stumbled, cursed, and finally bolted down the alley, disappearing into the night. Breathing hard, Jake turned to Sophia, who was still frozen against the wall, clutching her purse. "Are you okay?" he asked, trying to steady his voice despite the adrenaline still rushing through him. Sophia nodded, visibly shaken but unharmed. Yes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and relief. Jake gave a nervous chuckle, brushing the sweat off his forehead. "Guess I'm not as out of shape as I thought," he muttered awkwardly. For a brief moment, they stood there in the quiet alley, two strangers bound together by a sudden act of courage. Sophia managed a small smile, still catching her breath. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Jake shrugged, feeling the awkwardness settle back in. "No need. I just did what anyone would do." But as the words left his mouth, Jake knew they weren't entirely true. He could have kept walking. Most people probably would have. Instead, he had chosen to step in, not knowing what would happen. And now, as the tension of the moment slowly began to dissipate, he couldn't help but wonder about the woman standing in front of him, this stranger whose life had just briefly collided with his. They exchanged a few more polite words, her name, a quick introduction, and with that, Sophia thanked him once more before hurrying off into the night. Jake watched as she disappeared down the street, unaware that this chance encounter was only the beginning of something that would change his life forever. A few days later, Jake sat at his usual corner booth in the neighborhood cafe, sipping coffee and scrolling through news headlines on his phone. He hadn't thought much about the mugging since that night, other than replaying the moments in his mind to reassure himself that stepping in had been the right thing to do. But as he absent-mindedly scrolled, something caught his eye. A familiar face in a news article. He blinked, leaned closer, and read the headline. Local philanthropist Sophia Harper announces major initiative to support underprivileged communities. Jake's hand froze mid-sip, his mind racing. Sophia Harper? The same Sophia he had saved that night? He clicked on the article, and there she was. Her picture and bio splashed across the screen. Sophia Harper wasn't just a regular citizen. She was the founder of an organization dedicated to helping marginalized communities, known for her generosity and advocacy. Jake skimmed through the article in disbelief. Scholarships, shelters, food banks. Her charity had done it all. She had even been recognized at a recent awards ceremony for her humanitarian work. Jake sat back in his seat, stunned. The woman I saved. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone remarkable, someone who had made a tangible difference in the lives of others. And he, Jake, had walked away that night without a second thought, assuming she was just another stranger. The realization hit him hard. His mind swirled with questions. Why was she alone in that alley? Why didn't she mention anything about who she was? The woman he had saved wasn't just someone in need. She was someone who had likely saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives herself. The discovery weighed on Jake's mind for days. He found himself replaying their brief conversation, wondering what it would have been like if he had known who she was. Eventually, he decided he couldn't let things end the way they had. He needed to talk to her again, not for recognition, but because he felt compelled to understand her better. Jake reached out to the organization listed in the article, leaving a polite message explaining their encounter and expressing gratitude that she was safe. He didn't expect a response, but to his surprise, a reply came the very next day, an invitation to meet her in person. When the day arrived, Jake felt an uncharacteristic nervousness settle over him as he approached the community center where Sophia's charity was headquartered. The building buzzed with volunteers and visitors, and the energy inside was infectious, a world away from Jake's dull, predictable life. Sophia greeted him warmly when he entered, her smile as kind as it had been the night of the mugging. "Jake, right?" she said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for coming. I've been meaning to thank you properly." Jake shifted awkwardly. "You don't have to thank me," he said quickly. I didn't even know who you were." Sophia laughed lightly, waving it off. "That's probably for the best," she said. "I didn't want you thinking I was anything special. That night I was just someone in need of help." Jake was quiet for a moment, taking in her words. She spoke with such humility, despite the amazing work she had done. "You really could have told me," he finally said. "I mean, all this." He gestured around the room. "Everything you've done. It's incredible." Sophia smiled again, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. "What difference would it have made? You stepped in when it mattered. That's what counts." Her words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Jake felt something shift inside him, like a door opening, allowing him to see the world in a way he never had before. He had thought that his act of courage had been small, insignificant, but to Sophia, it had meant something. And now, standing here in this community center surrounded by people working tirelessly to make the world a better place, Jake began to realize that perhaps his life could have more meaning too. After their meeting at the community center, Jake found it hard to shake the feeling that his life was on the verge of a shift. Conversations with Sophia left him thinking about things he had never questioned before. What kind of impact he could have on others, and whether he had been living too small a life. A few days later, Jake received an unexpected call from Sophia. "I have a proposal for you," she said, her voice warm but with a hint of curiosity. "Are you busy tomorrow? We could really use some help at the shelter. Nothing fancy, just handing out meals and spending time with the residents." Jake hesitated for a second, but he couldn't think of a good reason to say no. "Sure," he replied. "I'd be happy to." The next day, Jake found himself at a homeless shelter run by Sophia's organization. It was bustling with activity, volunteers serving food, kids running around, and residents talking with social workers. The atmosphere felt different from anything Jake was used to, chaotic but full of warmth and purpose. He started by serving meals, a task that seemed simple enough, but as the day went on, he found himself drawn into conversations with the shelter's residents. Some shared stories of hardship, others moments of hope. What struck Jake the most was how grateful they were, not just for the food, but for the time and attention. Sophia floated through the room, chatting effortlessly with everyone, treating the residents like old friends. She wasn't just running a charity, she was genuinely connected to the people she served. Watching her, Jake realized that helping others wasn't about grand gestures or changing the world overnight. It was about being present, showing kindness, and offering what little you could, even when it felt like it wasn't enough. By the end of the day, Jake felt exhausted but fulfilled in a way he hadn't in years. As he helped clean up, Sophia approached him with a grateful smile. "You were great today," she said. "The residents loved talking to you." Jake shrugged modestly, but inside he felt something stir, a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. Over the next few weeks, Jake found himself returning to the shelter again and again. He started volunteering regularly, becoming a familiar face among the staff and residents. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful, and slowly, Jake began to feel connected to the people he met, to the city, and, most unexpectedly, to Sophia. During one quiet afternoon at the shelter, Jake and Sophia sat together on a bench outside, sipping coffee during a break. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city streets. "You know," Jake began thoughtfully, "before all this, I never really thought much about people's stories. I always figured everyone was responsible for their own problems. But being here, meeting these people, it's made me realize how wrong I was. Life can be brutal and some things are just out of our control." Sophia nodded, her expression soft. "It's easy to assume we understand someone's situation from the outside," she said, "but everyone carries something invisible, something we can't see until we take the time to listen." Jake stared into his coffee, reflecting on her words. "The night I saved you," he began hesitantly. "I thought I was just doing a good deed for someone random, but if I had known who you were, I probably would have treated you differently." Sophia gave him a knowing smile. "And that's exactly why I didn't tell you. Who I am shouldn't matter. What matters is how we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us in return." Her words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. All his life he had measured people by what they could do for him, whether they could help him advance or be of use in some way. But Sophia had shown him a different way to live, a life centered not on transactions but on genuine connection. He felt a lump rise in his throat, overwhelmed by the realization of how small his world had been until now. And for the first time in a long while, Jake knew he wanted to be someone better, someone who could live by the values Sophia embodied. The changes in Jake's life came slowly, but steadily. He began to see the world through a different lens, less as a place where people were problems to avoid, and more as a space where everyone carried stories worth hearing. His old routines started to shift as well. Instead of hurrying home after work, Jake found himself looking forward to his time at the shelter. Sophia had become more than just a passing figure in his life. Their connection deepened as they spent more time together, sharing stories, thoughts, and ideas. Jake felt grateful for her friendship, but more than that, he felt inspired by her. Sophia's quiet humility and unwavering dedication to helping others made him want to be the kind of person who left a mark, not through wealth or status but through kindness, One evening, after another long day of volunteering, Sophia and Jake sat together on a park bench, looking out at the lights of the city. For a while, neither of them spoke, content in the comfortable silence that had developed between them. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "I've spent a lot of my life thinking that people only deserved help if they earned it," he said quietly. "But the truth is, none of us really get through life on our own. We all need someone at some point." Sophia gave him a soft smile. "That's a beautiful realization, Jake," she said warmly. "It's not always about grand gestures or changing the whole world. Sometimes it's just about being there for the people around you." Jake nodded, the weight of her words settling deep within him. He knew that the man he had been a few months ago, detached, self-centered, indifferent, was someone he no longer wanted to be. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally moving toward the person he was meant to become. Months passed, and Jake's transformation became evident to those around him. He not only continued volunteering but also started leading initiatives at the shelter, organizing food drives and mentoring others who wanted to get involved. He used his work connections to secure resources for the shelter, and even convinced some of his skeptical friends to volunteer. The ripple effect of his newfound purpose didn't stop at the shelter. Jake's relationships with his family and friends improved too. He listened more, judged less, and showed up for people in ways he never had before. One evening, the shelter organized a small celebration for its volunteers. The room was filled with laughter and gratitude, and Sophia took a moment to express her appreciation. "I've been fortunate to meet incredible people in my life," she said to the group, "but some of the most powerful moments come from those who find their way here unexpectedly and discover something new about themselves along the way." She caught Jake's eye across the room, and they shared a brief smile, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through together. Later that night, Jake and Sophia found themselves once again sitting quietly under the stars. As they looked up at the night sky, Jake spoke softly. "I used to think that wealth or success was the only way to make a difference in life," he said. "But now I realize the real wealth is in the connections we make, the people we help, and the way we treat others, even when no one is watching." Sophia nodded, her eyes warm with approval. "That's the kind of wealth that lasts," she replied. And in that moment, Jake knew this was the life he wanted to live. A life where kindness was currency, where empathy was strength, and where small acts of bravery could lead to something greater than he had ever imagined. For the first time in his life, Jake felt truly rich.